Hello, this is a presentation on French semi-postal stamps, and it is a presentation for the Winnipeg Philatelic Society, Western Canada's oldest stamp club. And I guess the idea for the presentation came to me as I was starting to assemble my French stamp collection. And you come to the spots in your album where you can put French semi-postal stamps, and there are rather a lot of them. And the first ones you come to, of course, are quite expensive, and so they're cataloged in the back of the book. And if you're a Scott catalog fan, those aren't real stamps. And as I said, they were expensive. So initially I said, well, I'm not going to collect French semi-postal stamps in my collection because they're not real stamps. And I've changed my mind, and this presentation will kind of show you why. Because I found French semi-postal stamps just about as interesting as the ordinary, fully postal French stamps. So my perspective, of course, is from Canada. I also collect the United Kingdom and the United States. And semi-postal stamps are not particularly common either in Canada, the US, or the UK. The United States has issued 5. They're in the process of a 6th. And they were for a variety of topics. You can see them listed there. They've raised rather a lot of money with a population of 330 million. 63 million bucks on those 5 stamps. The first one got 44 million. That was a very successful fundraising stamp for getting rid of cancer. The United Kingdom, with a population of 66 million, had 1 stamp for the disabled and 4 Christmas stamps of Cathedrals that were semi-postal fundraising stamps, but that stopped rather a long time ago. Canada, with a population of 37 million, issued 12 for the 1976 Olympics, and then there was a long gap, and they issued 1 for literacy, 3 for mental health, and now they're in the swing of issuing stamps for the Canada Post Foundation, and they issue more every year, so 8 by the time you're listening to this probably isn't the right number. They do rather well, actually. It's a dime a stamp, and they give away about $130,000 a year to some really rather interesting projects. So that means they sell 1.3 million stamps in aid of the Canada Post Foundation. So that's kind of successful. Anyway, like I said, these are back of the book in the Scott catalog. In the Yvert catalog, which is kind of the leading catalog for French stamps, they're not back of the book. They're not back of the book in Gibbons either. Other countries, the Netherlands, children sell semi-postal stamps door to door. In New Zealand, and I lived in New Zealand for a while, and I remember buying health stamps in the school. And note here, they're not back of the book in Gibbons. They're just considered part of the normal run of stamps. And so here is, and what you bought in school is you bought a little miniature sheet. So that sheet would have cost 30 cents. So that's something that you in school could buy. You get your mom and dad to give you some money. You'd buy 1 or 2, and then you'd take them home, and mom and dad would probably use them to mail letters. Anyway, they're popular in other countries. It's not just France that has semi-postal stamps. France has issued more than 700 semi-postal stamps, a lot. They've got a population of about 67 million, similar in size to Great Britain. And I've kind of broken it down between 1914 when it started and the year 2000, and I just kind of stopped at the year 2000. The number of semi-postal stamps after 2000 has kind of declined. So 1914 to 1918, that's World War I. There were 11 stamps issued, and the average catalog value in US dollars, yikes, is $226. So, as I said, when I first came to them in my album and started saying, am I going to get those? I went, oh no, they're too expensive. They remain too expensive, never mind. 1920 to 1938, 69 stamps, average catalog value $26. And I think what this indicates now, and you'll see it, 6314, 63 cents, $1.18, $1.31. These stamps were widely and broadly used in France. And so in France, they're considered to be real stamps, and the fact that they have a fundraising element to them, they are considered real stamps. This is the price for used stamp. So people were buying them and using them to mail letters. And so the French at least consider them to be real stamps. So after a while I've decided, okay, they are real stamps, I'll collect them. And then I found that they were as interesting as French stamps. I find French stamps really interesting to collect. Gives you a little window into French culture and history. Their stamps are very, very nicely designed. In particular, the art stamps. They're large size stamps, and they have classic pieces of art on them, or perhaps some that I would consider not so classic, but notwithstanding, they're very attractive stamps. So between 1920 and 38, 69 stamps. Between 1931 and May, June of 1940, which is World War II, is on, but France has not fallen, 22 stamps, $6 average value. Between 1940 and 1944, that's the occupation of France, 22 issued per year, total 90 stamps. Average catalog value $3.20. So even though the war was on, people used these stamps to mail letters. And then 9 per year, no particular rhyme or reason to the years I picked, 1944 through 2000, 9, 5, 8. You can see rather a lot issued, but the catalog value indicates that lots of people use them, and there's lots of used stamps out there to collect. So let's look at what French semi-postal stamps are. It started in 1914 to issue stamps to raise funds for the Red Cross. And it was intermittent through 1949, but after 1950, there was an annual fundraising stamp for the Red Cross. Now, if you collect French stamps, you will know that France often uses an image of a French icon, often female. First French stamps were series. Here we have La Semeuse, designed by Oscar Rotti. So that's the stamp at the top. That is a routine French definitive stamp, 10 centimes, and it's been surcharged by 5 centimes for the Red Cross. And when I first looked at it, I always said that's 10 plus 5. I think really it's 10 and 5 cents for the Red Cross is what it's intended to mean. And the other thing, if you collect French stamps, you will know that France very often surcharges stamps, much more often than, for instance, I'm used to in Canada. So not at all unusual that they would decide when they're issuing this stamp, oh, let's just surcharge the 10 centime stamp. And you will see they did get around in 1914 to actually engraving up a stamp, same design roughly, a little more clear that it's 5 cents for the Red Cross. And you even see a Croix Rouge going up the side there. So they're saying Red Cross and postage. So those are the first 2 semi-postal stamps. The semi-postal stamps that are the problem in terms of I'm never going to have them in my collection were the war orphan stamps, the orphelins de la guerre. And you can see they issued 8 stamps in 1917 with a variety of values and a variety of surcharges. And you'll see the surcharge wasn't cheap. The 5 franc stamp has a 5 franc surcharge. And that's in the context of it takes 2 centimes to mail a letter. So 10 francs is really rather an astronomically large amount of money, particularly during the middle of the Second World War, towards the end, 1917. So you can imagine the higher values of this issue did not sell particularly well, even though they kept them on sale till 1922. And finally in 1922, I guess they went, well, we're just not selling as many as we could. Let's surcharge them. Typical, as I said, France does this a lot. And so they surcharged the entire issue, dropping the size of the surcharge. So from 3 centimes down to 1, the 5 franc dropped down to 1 franc. The Lion of Belfort there went from 50 centimes to 10 centimes. So a significant drop. These were used more frequently. And then in 1926, maybe they'd sold them all, I don't know. They decided to reissue just 4. And this time they re-engraved them with the new lower surcharge. So if there's a average high value for French semi-postal stamps, it's these stamps here in particular that I'm not going to have in my collection. The sinking fund of 1927 to 1931. I was at a stamp show and a colleague came over, a fellow collector came over and said, look at this cover. It's dressed to the Prince Albert Sinking Fund. I'm not going to give them any money. It's sinking. And we laughed, and I then explained what a sinking fund was. And in the good old days, a long time ago, if you were a church, let's say, not for profit or something like that, and you wanted to borrow money to build a building, and you got a mortgage of, let's say, $100,000, let's say that was enough to build the building, and you were to pay it back in 10 years, the way it worked was 10 years from the day you got it, you paid it back in full, and you only paid interest for 10 years. Now that's convenient to the lender because they don't have to worry about figuring out whether it's principal or interest, and they lend their money once and it's out for 10 years. If you get a combined principal and interest payment, the mortgage amount is slowly going down and they have to find someone else to lend it to. The downside of that, of course, is 10 years from now, maybe you don't have the money to pay it back. So what lenders started to do is say, okay, you have to have a sinking fund. You have to put away $10,000 a year for 10 years. So when we're done, you will have the $100,000 to pay me back. So the downside, of course, of that for you is you're investing $10,000 a year at a lower rate of interest than you're borrowing. And so that's probably why that's no longer done and you just make a combined monthly principal and interest payment. Anyway, in French, a sinking fund is caisse d'amortissement. Case literally means box. In Canada, we're used to it meaning a credit union, but it's a box to put money in. So it's a box to put money in that will amortize away our debt. So the stamps were either printed caisse d'amortissement or just CA. And that was, the purpose of it was to pay for the war effort, to pay for the First World War, to reduce the national debt. And it was actually reasonably successful in doing so. They issued quite a large number of stamps and they sold, and people did their patriotic duty and helped to pay off the war debt by buying stamps. In Canada, in 1917, we brought in the income tax, temporary only for the war. It was going to go away, haha. In Germany, they printed money to pay off the war debt and pay off reparations, resulted in hyperinflation, and some people would argue that resulted in the Second World War. Anyway, here are the stamps, and again, as I said, they love to overprint stamps. So there we have la semeuse, and it's overprinted caisse d'amortissement. And it's 40 centimes plus 10, so not a bad additional amount. Makes it add up to a nice round 50 centimes. We have Pasteur. Pasteur is one of the few males and one of the few real people that appears on a French definitive stamp. So there's the Pasteur definitive, 150, overprinted 50, rounds up to a nice 2 francs. Then some of the stamps were separately engraved for the caisse d'amortissement, and here we have 2 of them. The first one, we've got a worker and I guess 2 workers. One's got some kind of big gear over his shoulder. 150 for postage and 850 for the case. So a 1 franc 50 stamp costs you 10 francs. Those weren't used a lot. The sourire d'Arimes, same thing, 150 plus 350. So the surcharge became rather significant. And there are a whole series of these stamps. Most of them were overprints. And they're hard to figure out because you have a 40 centime blue stamp overprinted in black, overprinted in red, overprinted in blue, and you've got to sort them all out. It's kind of fun. Then we have semi-postal stamps for the unemployed in 1935 and 1938. And again, from a Canadian perspective, if we issued stamps to deal with unemployed, I don't know, auto workers or something like that, I can imagine people buying those stamps. These are for unemployed intellectuals. You can't quite read it, chômeur intellectuel. The bottom stamp is for arts and thinkers. And the surcharge, the surtax, is significant. It's 50 centimes plus 2 francs. But these stamps sold, they're not that difficult to get. The catalog value is not that high, so people bought them and supported relief for unemployed intellectuals. And we have several series of these. Here we have Berlioz. There you can see pour les chômeurs intellectuels, unemployed intellectuals. We have Berlioz and we have Rodin. And again, these stamps, not a particularly high catalog value, so people bought them and mailed letters with them. Something more to fit in the Canadian motif, the children of the unemployed. And this is 1939, 90 plus 35 centimes. Employees of the Post, Telephone, and Telegraph. If you watch Maigret TV series, which has Mr. Bean as Maigret, he does a great job. But as he's out investigating, he will occasionally dash into the office of La Poste, and it's Téléphone, Telegraph, in the middle La Poste, to make a phone call, because that's where the only phones are. I found that interesting. Anyway, here we have some stamps, 3 stamps, for the benefit of the employees of the Post, Telephone, and Telegraph, Sports and Leisure. And we have a stamp. There's some kids and a couple of adults, I guess, on the beach. Some are playing tug-of-war, some are doing other things. Underneath that, we have 3 folks running a race and somebody right beside them throwing a discus. The one I find really interesting is the inn for the employees of the Post, Telephone, and Telegraph. And here are some folks. They've got their hiking gear on and their knapsacks, and they're going down the road, and there is the inn for the PTT, Sports and Leisure. Now, the surtax is only 10 centimes, is not so bad. And again, people bought and used these stamps. Social causes. This is something more Canadian, perhaps. Canada is obviously different from France, and France is different from Canada. Sauver la race, national health, radio for the blind, the glory of the French infantry to raise money for French soldiers, 65 plus 1 franc 10, for the French repatriated from Spain after the Spanish Civil War, and social causes for students. So here we have a nurse and a student reading a book, and the nurse is helping the student with health. As the war begins, we get a little more militaristic theme. We have a stamp for our soldiers, rounds up to a nice 1 franc. We have 2 heroes of the First World War, Marshal Joffre and General Galien, both heroes of the First World War. And so they have stamps with surcharges. After the fall of France, late 1940 through 1945, we now have the Vichy government installed, Marshal Pétain, hero of the Second World War, but I think he kind of lost his reputation with the French because he became the Vichy puppet government. But he had a national relief fund, and so there were stamps issued to raise money for that. And you can see the surcharge is 1 franc plus 2 francs on both those stamps. And people are working hard to keep the country going. The 80 centimes plus 5 francs for our prisoners of war. I kind of didn't understand that, because why would we have French prisoners of war in the Second World War? Well, of course, they were taken prisoner in the initial fall of France. And in 1941, through the end of the war, 2 million prisoners of war were held in Germany. It was 10% of the male population. So that was a really significant impact on France during the Second World War. 1 franc 50 plus 3 francs 50, nice 5 francs for oeuvre de l'air, French airmen and their families. Chabrier, charities for musicians, 2 plus 3. The blue stamp is Pétain, 2 plus 12. And even those stamps, they're not that terribly expensive in the catalog, so they were bought and used, and people put them on envelopes. The stamp up in the top right corner, that's one of a series of crests of French cities, 5 plus 7 franc surcharge. It has a market value of €1.40, so not that bad. And there's a series of 10 or 12 of them. Well, then the gray stamp down at the bottom, we'll come back to this. This was for the benefit of civilians under air attack. Dunkirk, Billancourt, which was a Renault factory that got bombed. Lorient, which was a U-boat base, and Saint-Nazaire, which was a commando raid after Dieppe. So it's and we're showing how devastated. And at the Billancourt raid, 1,200 civilians were killed. So war is not nice. But here we have a mom, and it looks like her other kid is dead or badly injured. And we're saying how terrible the Allies are for bombing French civilians. 1945, the war is over. And so we go back to the PTT for our victims of the war, and here are a French family. I assume it's a postman, his wife, and their 2 kids, and their meager possessions, all that are left, are on the wheelbarrow, but they're going by a destroyed house, but towards the sunrise, and things are going to be okay. We have 2 kids running outside in the fresh air, getting healthy again. Saint-Malo, one of the war-damaged cities, so we're raising money for war-damaged cities, 4 francs plus 4 francs. The PTT is 4 francs plus 6 francs. Oradour, 4 plus 2. Oradour was a Nazi massacre, kind of horrible. 190 men were shot and burned, and 247 women and 205 children were burned alive in a church. Most of the perpetrators were killed in action in the Normandy invasion, and even Rommel protested the atrocity. Moving on to happier topics. Journée du timbre began in 1938, and starting in 1944, a stamp or 2 was issued every year for stamp collecting. Journée du timbre was a annual festival of stamp collecting in France. France and La Poste do a lot of work to promote stamp collecting. In the year 2000, it became the Fete du Timbre. Up until 1999, it was some image of the history of the French postal system. So something to do with La Poste. After 1999, to appeal to kids and to get kids to collect stamps, it was cartoons. Until 2002, the surcharge for La Journée du Timbre or Fête du Timbre went to the Red Cross. So promoting stamp collecting, but money to the Red Cross. After 2002 and until 2004, it went to Adphile, Association pour le développement de la philatélité. It's an educational institution to promote stamp collecting. Very different from anything we have in Canada. This is Adphile, Education Through Stamps. And the members of Adphile, and a sort of Canadian equivalent, even though we have nothing like Adphile, the members are La Poste, so Canada Post would be the Canadian equivalent. Federation of the French Philatelic Associations, kind of like the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada, though if you look at the FFP website, it seems like a much bigger organization. CNEP, the Union of Sellers and Experts in Stamps, kind of a super CSDA, Canadian Stamp Dealers Association, and again, from their website, they seem to be a much bigger organization. Now, of course, the French Red Cross is involved because they raise money. The Canadian Red Cross wouldn't be involved in promoting stamp collecting at all because they get no money from it. And the French Press Corps is one of the 5 members of Adphile. And occasionally there are Adphile stamps issued. So supporting the Red Cross, supporting Adphile through issuing stamps, they do a big job. So here are some examples of journee du timbre stamps. Most of them have a date on them, which makes it helpful when you're collecting. De Vier on the, I think that's 1949, not sure. He started a postal system in Paris in 1653. The blue stamp is a letter carrier. It's got the date on it. The gray stamp, 12 plus 3 francs, folks are sorting mail in a railway mail car. D'Argenson was involved in La Poste in 1751, and of course we have a stagecoach carrying the mail. One of the things that's interesting about French stamps, I said they have a lot of French icons on stamps. So Marianne de Dulac, Dulac was the artist who came up with the iconic image of Marianne, and the stamp on the stamp is the definitive stamp from 1944. So here we have 1994, 50th anniversary. So we have a regular postage stamp, 2 francs 80, and we have a semi-postal stamp, an additional 60 cents. And sometimes what happened was you bought a booklet with a couple or 3 semi-postal stamps and a couple or 3 just regular stamps, and you would get a Citizen stamp like this one. So that's Marianne de Dulac from semi-postal stamp from 1994. Marianne de Gandon, 1995, again, same thing. That's a definitive postage stamp from 1945, and that's again Marianne. And again, we have a normal postage stamp and a semi-postal stamp together in a booklet. We remember La Semeuse, and here she is, the Red Cross semi-postal stamp. I didn't quite get this stamp when I first saw it, but if you kind of look, you will see it's kind of a section of La Semeuse, and that's her arm from the back and her hair from the back. She's kind of moving forward, throwing seeds on the field. So again, La Semeuse from 1903, postal and semi-postal stamp issued in 1996. And this was never a semi-postal stamp, but Liberty by Delacroix. That is Liberty, another iconic French image. So I said they started to use cartoons, so in 2000 we're now Fete du Timbre, and here we have Tonton and Milou, and we have the Captain and Dupont and Dupond, translated in English quite cleverly. Well, Dupont and Dupond is also clever, but they're Thompson and Thompson, one with an M and one without an M. And we have the Professor, and so you see we have a postage stamp and a semi-postal stamp, and in the year 2000 we're in the process of converting to euros, so we have the euro equivalent on the stamp. Scott, by the way, by the time we get here, The postal and semi-postal stamps, because they're issued together, often as a booklet, and in this case as a souvenir sheet, they don't catalog the semi-postal stamp as a B stamp. It's just in the regular catalog. So if you're looking for the semi-postal stamps in Scott, you find some of them cataloged as B and some of them in the normal part of the catalog. So 2004 and 2005, we have Mickey and Minnie. We see that the French are not shy about having other people's images. Tonton is Belgian, Mickey and Minnie are American, Titouf is Swiss, and we also see that Titouf is a little bit rude, but never mind. We also see that after 2004, there are no more semi-postal stamps for fete de timbre. They're just cartoons for kids. And indeed, after 2004, semi-postal stamps become fewer and mainly for the Red Cross. Here's another way that French semi-postal stamps were sold. They were sold in a booklet. The Young Girl and the Little Dog, and L'Oiseau Mort, the dead bird. So the dead bird's kind of a sad stamp, I think, but never mind. These were all for the Red Cross. We can see that prominently. These are famous pieces of French art, and by coincidence, you will see it adds up to 4 francs to buy the 8 stamps, the way they've done the surcharge. And had a nice little illustration on the cover, and it says it's for the Red Cross on the cover. So you get $3.20 in postage for 4 francs. Now, one of the other things, I said this before, there are a number of themes on French stamps which makes collecting French stamps very interesting. I probably don't have them all down here, but we have Marianne, Ceres, Liberty, all of those things. I've talked about them, and some of those, as I say, appear on semi-postal stamps. But famous individuals, war heroes, art stamps, the French issue a large number of very attractive art stamps with some piece of art on it, and most of them are large size. Cathedrals, and there are 200 cathedrals in France and other famous buildings. And I have to pause here because there was a TV show where one of the characters said, mea cathedra, mea regula. And I was translating that, my cathedral, my rules. So I looked up what cathedra means, and it means chair or seat. So I'm going, my chair or my house, my rules. Mea casa, mea regula. House is domum or casa. Church is an ecclesia or templum. So why don't they call a cathedral one of those 2 words? The answer, of course, is if I'd been smarter, the cathedral is the seat of the bishop. So that's where the bishop's seat is, and hence it's a cathedra or a cathedral. And I've talked about the Red Cross, that's another theme, and various specific items have occurred on, of course, all stamps and indeed on semi-postal stamps. So some examples of that. Famous individuals, here we have Villon, he's a poet. Charles VII, Napoleon, they list him as Napoleon I. Napoleon III, who was his cousin, became president of France and later emperor of France up until 1870, when he was captured in the Franco-Prussian War and deposed and went to London to live in exile. Famous individuals, we have Yvert, who was the Archbishop of Paris, died in 1848, trying to mediate peace in the June uprising. Robespierre, I don't know what to call him. I don't know he was a hero of the French Revolution. He was certainly a notable individual in the French Revolution, but he was later rather gruesomely executed during the French Revolution. Bichat, an anatomist who died in the age of 30 from a fall. It's one of the other good things about stamp collecting. You find out things about people you never knew about. I'm going, how can you be so famous that if you die at age 30, you get a stamp for you? And indeed, he was and remains a very famous anatomist, even though he died at age 30. As Tom Lehrer would say, By the time Mozart was my age, he'd been dead for 20 years. War heroes. 1946 Naval Charities, Yvert de la Marine. We have the Commando Raid on Saint-Nazaire, commemorating and celebrating the Commando Raid at the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire. And we remember the civilians under air attack during the war. So this is from 1947, and we have a change of heart as to whether or not it was a good idea or not. Oh, the other thing I probably should have pointed out, French stamps either say RF, République Française, EF, Empire France. When Napoleon declared himself emperor, they became Empire of France, or sometimes just France or République Française. So there are different ways of describing the country. War heroes Leclerc and Delattre. Leclerc is a really interesting guy. Both of these guys were fighting generals, and Leclerc is a tremendous hero in France. In France, he would just be known as Leclerc. He was made Marshal of France after his death. He was born Philippe François Marie de Hautecouc, and he added Leclerc after the war because he had a wife and 12 children in France, and he figured if he used his real name, they would be captured and tortured or something bad. So he adopted the name Leclerc as a nom de guerre. And he was captured twice by the Nazis, escaped both times, made his way to join the Allies, made it to North Africa, where he fought in North Africa with the Free French, got his men, I didn't understand the significance of this until I studied the stamp, but he got his men to swear that they would stay enlisted until Strasbourg was freed. I didn't get that, but Strasbourg is on the far eastern border of France with Germany. So the liberation of Strasbourg was the liberation of France. He was also liberated Paris, and that's an interesting story because Eisenhower had decided during the war that they would just skip the cities. It was too costly men and material to fight their way through a city. So they were planning on just going around Paris. Hitler wanted Paris destroyed and burned. The regular army general in charge refused to do that. So as the Allies approached, the French resistance, figuring that they were going to be here shortly, started to fight, and a lot of people started to be killed. So de Gaulle finally persuaded Eisenhower that they would take Paris. So with a relatively small force, Leclerc zoomed into Paris. The Germans surrendered, and Paris was liberated with subsequently very little loss of life. But before, there was quite a bit of fighting, and people were dying. The same thing with the liberation of Strasbourg, though by this time it was pretty apparent to the German forces that they were going to lose. They were told to fight to their last bullet, and many people threw away all but one of their bullets, fired the last one they had, and said, "Oh, now I can surrender." Delattre was another fighting hero. Here he's shown at the war conference at the end of the war in Berlin. I call these crossovers because I said we have art stamps, but these are journée du timbre stamps and or stamps for the Red Cross, but they feature an art piece. So on the journée du timbre there we have a love letter, and it's a Goya painting. A woman is reading a love letter. On the stamp at the bottom we have a stained glass window from a church. So we have an art, Red Cross, and we're raising money, and we're promoting stamp collecting. A couple of more fundraising stamps. Journée du timbre again, a Picasso painting, a woman reading a letter, I think. And we have a silk from Lyon. So 2 pieces of art, and we're raising money for the Red Cross, because Journée du timbre was for the Red Cross. Cathedrals and buildings, and again I said I think every French cathedral has been on a building. This is part of a set of 5 from 1947. And you see the surcharge again. You keep watching them as they go by, but it's now 6 plus 4. So the surcharges are getting bigger. And of course, very sad, here we have Notre Dame. I've been to the Notre Dame and I was very, very sad when I heard of the fire. Hopefully it will be okay. Red Cross again. We have Cupid, L'amour. He's raising money for the Red Cross. Michel de la Paix was an educator and father of the deaf from 1712. And Frejus was a dam collapse. 423 people died, so we promptly overprinted a definitive stamp to raise 5 francs for the victims of Frejus. And of course, we have to have a stamp raising funds for the French Postal Museum at the very end. I have to thank stampsfrance.com. That's where I got most of the images from. They're a commercial company that sells stamps of France and many other European countries. So thanks to them for the images, and thanks to you for listening. Thanks.